MSG causes headaches, tingling arms, chest tightness, and a general feeling of weakness. And you know that it's bad for you. It's just one of those things that we all know that we should avoid, right? Have you ever really wondered why? MSG was once public enemy number one. In the 60s, restaurants banned it, the media got very dramatic about it, brands fell over themselves to show how good they were to you by ditching it, and all the while, scientists must have been sitting there thinking, what the fuck? Because MSG is really common. It's in tomatoes, mushrooms, parmesan cheese, soy sauce, Marmite. It's all filled to the absolute tits with it. And it's made of two things that you need to function. So, how did something so ordinary get turned into this food villain, chemical killer, cocktail nightmare? Well, let's find out, shall we? Welcome back to Because Why. I'm Brianne West, and today I'm asking, because why are we so afraid of MSG? I don't ever really remember being told specifically that MSG was bad for you. It was more of like a thing that was in the ether. It was common knowledge that we just knew. Kind of like how everybody knows that the most venomous spider on earth is the daddy longlegs, even though that's not true at all. I do remember the first time I actively thought about it. I love Bin In. I know that makes me weird. I know that the gorgeously curated, Instagrammable, zero-waste stores are all the rage at the moment, but I like the original. You can find all sorts of things in a bin, and things that you never thought you needed until you saw them. It's low-key, it's not designed to be Instagrammable, and because of, I'm sorry to say it, but because it has less of a wank factor, it's way more affordable. This episode brought to you by Bin In. Just joking, I don't do ads. I used to shop at Bin In for antique ingredients back when I was still setting microwaves on fire by making shampoo bars in them. And one day I found one of those things that I didn't know I needed, and that was actually a barrel of MSG. I remember seeing this container of white powder sitting there and thinking, but isn't that really bad for you? So I was surprised to see it there, but I'm also quite curious, so I took some home with me. I bought it. I didn't just put some in my pocket. And I did some research. And man, the MSG story is a whole thing. Prepare to be disappointed in people. Again. A bit like you may have been disappointed this weekend in our government. Again. MSG's story begins in 1908 in Japan with a chemist named Kikune Ikeda. And I really hope I'm saying that right. He was eating his wife's dashi, which is a broth made with kombu, which is a type of seaweed, and he noticed a taste in there that he couldn't really describe. That is where umami comes from. It actually means delicious taste in Japanese, but we now use it as a way to broadly describe this sort of savory taste. Ikeda, naturally being a chemist, wanted to isolate what the deliciousness was. By evaporating and crystallizing the broth, he found glutamic acid, which is a form of an amino acid that scientists were already very familiar with. Now, on its own, glutamic acid isn't usable. It's not in an easy-to-store crystalline form. So he bound it with sodium in creating the star of today's show, MSG. A little while later, he formed a company with his business partner, and in 1909, they began to sell MSG. It was almost immediately beloved in Japan. At that point, urbanization and industrialization was kicking in. Families were cooking less from scratch. There was less of the all-day-long cooked soups, and MSG made those foods taste like homemade cooking without all of the time involved. Over the next few decades, as the Japanese continued to colonize parts of Asia, they took MSG with them. In China, MSG became a key seasoning in street food and home cooking, and in Korea, it was added to instant noodles. In the Philippines, to stews and snacks. It was marketed as a modern flavor enhancer, kind of just like salt and sugar. The West joined in, of course. We do love delicious salty things, but this was a cultural thing, because after the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a huge surge of hatred towards the Japanese across America, as you'd expect, right? But this also created a wave of sympathy for the Chinese, who had been under the Japanese thumb for decades. This is a huge part of why parts of Chinese culture is a big thing in America, even today, things like Chinese restaurants or Chinatowns, because they became very popular then and are still today. And MSG was a part of that and became part of the mainstream diet in America too. And then, of course, because brands follow consumer demand, always worth remembering, we have the ultimate power. Companies like Campbell's and Heinz and Kraft all added it to their products. And it was even added to MREs, the stuff given to soldiers in World War II. And when those soldiers came home from war, they were accustomed to that taste, and so it became more and more embedded in the average daily diet. By the 1950s and 60s, MSG was largely everywhere. It was a marvel of modern food scientists. Ajinomoto, which was the name of the company selling MSG, they even ran advertising campaigns framing it as a scientific breakthrough that would improve nutrition around the world because this stuff made vegetables tasty. Just no mean feat. Unfortunately, that didn't age very well. In 1968, a bloke wrote a letter. A doctor and researcher called Dr. Ho Man Kwok wrote to the New England Journal of Medicine. He described how after eating at Chinese restaurants in the USA, he felt ill. His neck felt numb, he felt weak, he got a rapid heartbeat. And in this letter, he wondered if it was the soy sauce or the cooking wine or perhaps even the MSG. Now, from what researchers can ascertain, and this is grayer than you would have thought, They don't think there's any malice behind this. They don't think this was something designed to create the alarm that it led to. He seemed to genuinely want to know the answer. The article certainly had a particularly inflammatory heading, though. It was called Chinese Restaurant Syndrome. And just as a quick aside here, because if this story isn't weird enough, another doctor, Dr. Howard Steele, claimed that he wrote the letter under a pseudonym after a beat with a friend. He said the pseudonym was an obvious joke, right? Ho Man Kwok, human croc as in crock of shit. But it turns out there actually was a Dr. Ho Man Kwok, and he also claimed he did write the letter. So who did? No, honestly, no one's totally sure. The families both have different stories, so who knows what happened. But weird. Anyway, the New England Journal was hardly a mass market magazine that everybody read, but it was highly respected, and reporters would do what they do today, which is badly explain science in their stories, inadvertently spreading misinformation. This was one of those instances, and within just a couple of weeks, the phrase Chinese restaurant syndrome was in newspapers around the country and starting to spread further afield. That is a perfect example of just how fast misinformation can spread. Because remember, this was just a letter. This wasn't a scientific study. It wasn't a journal. There was no evidence. It's just a letter. Then other doctors joined in. They also wrote to the journal as well. They added their own stories or their friends or their patients. They claimed that there was fainting or headaches, back spasms, sweating, fatigue, temperatures. None of the letters listed the same symptoms. None of them had the same time after eating. None of them had the same duration of illness. There was seemingly no links between any of the letters or any of the concerns, although geography did seem important because New York restaurants were dodgy, but restaurants in London seemed okay. Again, no measurement, no facts, no proof, and yet the media treated it as fact. And this was around the same time that the environmental movement really started to kick off, and pesticides and chemicals were in the news, so people were starting to get afraid of chemicals and synthetics. Distrust of ingredients like dyes, artificial sweeteners started to ramp up, so it was kind of the perfect storm of timing. But it does seem a little bit odd, right? That at no point did anybody seriously point this out and put an end to this absolute nonsense before it got carried away. Because some of these letters, man, they were just crying out to be mocked. One blamed chopsticks. In the letter, he blamed the fact that Westerners couldn't cope with, quote, the physical strain of using chopsticks. Granted, I'm sure most of us have struggled with chopsticks at some point, but we've not fainted or had some kind of weird generalized weakness afterwards, have we? Humiliation, sure. But I suppose I do prefer his hypothesis over the idea that it was this foreign chemical that we've been eating for decades and never had a problem with before. But all of a sudden we've realized it's Chinese and, it's probably killing us. Finally, somebody stepped in and said, you know what we need? We need some science. And let's figure out if this is an issue or if it's collective hysteria. Unfortunately, it wasn't very good science. Obviously, I am a big fan of the scientific method. It is a very robust way of determining facts, finding evidence, and despite what loads of people on the internet will tell you, it's actually difficult to just make stuff up and roll away on your super yacht. But just because the scientific method is robust doesn't mean everybody follows said method. Because the research conducted at MSG was not very good. It was so flawed. Oh my God. Some studies were not properly blinded, which means bias can creep in. Some involved consuming all of the items on a menu for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then documenting how ill you felt. Some studies didn't account for anxiety, and of course, symptoms like racing heart or dizziness are often symptoms of anxiety. If you are told you're eating something that may cause you harm, you might be a little anxious. Almost all of them had tiny, tiny sample sizes, some as low as 6. And they were often just given pure MSG on an empty stomach. And interestingly enough, MSG on its own tastes horrific. It has to be mixed with something else to taste delicious. All of these studies, and I use that term very lightly, should have been thrown straight in the bin. The studies that were given the most credence were done on mice. That wasn't the biggest issue. The researchers injected the equivalent amount of MSG into these mice as if you sat down and ate half a kg of it. Except not so much as if you sat down and ate half a kg. It's as if you are a mouse, except, of course, you are not. And you injected half a kg of MSG straight into your bloodstream. Not really representative of real-life conditions. Flawed with a capital F. Again, the study wasn't blind, so he knew which mice had had the placebo versus the MSG. And that can really change results because bias is unconscious. And even scientists have the best intentions can unintentionally affect results. That's why best practice is properly blinded studies. Basic science. I don't know what these people were doing. The head researcher behind this series of studies didn't really seem to care about that and continued winding up media and therefore the general public. There was a talk about national ban in the USA. Activists started protesting. It became a whole thing. All because one researcher confused mice with people. And unfortunately, it is these kind of scientists that people point to when they say that the whole institution is bad. And to that I say, of course, there's bad eggs everywhere. And actually, that could be unfair. I don't know his motivation. He could genuinely have believed it was a concern and be trying to help people, but his own bias influenced his work. He's only human. And as for the media who perpetuated that information, it's worth remembering that very few journalists can actually read a scientific paper because there's a lot more to it than just reading an abstract. Now, there is a pretty clear racial undertone here. MSG has been used in American processed food for decades without anyone getting overly excited, but when it was connected to Chinese restaurants and called Chinese restaurant syndrome, then people got very scared about this foreign chemical. That phrase tied it to an entire cuisine, an entire group of people, not so much to the chemical itself. By the early 1970s, the panic was in full swing. Restaurants very proudly talked about how they had no MSG in their products, even in places that had never used it. Yes, same tactic they're doing now. Food companies jumped on board by showing how much they cared about you by removing the MSG. And those actions reinforce that reputation, so it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, exactly like the stupid idea of clean ingredients in the beauty industry. It's why people are frightened of things like parabens or sodium lauryl sulfate, despite there being no need to. I spent most of my time at Atique refusing to have anything to do with spreading this disinformation, despite quite a lot of pressure, and I was always the one made to feel unreasonable about it. Facts matter, people. When brands parrot nonsense, which they know isn't true because, and I quote, the customer expects it, they perpetuate harmful misinformation. People have a surprisingly high level of trust in brands. It's lazy marketing. If you can't sell your product without lying, do you think maybe you need a new career? Slightly off topic, that winds me up. The fallout lasted a long time. It's still going on now. The media coverage became more and more overtly xenophobic, and by the 1980s, MSG was one of the most vilified things ever. It didn't matter that at that point there was lots of studies saying the complete opposite, that MSG was perfectly safe. It didn't matter that regulatory bodies around the world said it was perfectly fine. Chinese restaurant syndrome was a thing and people were scared of it. Food scientists really must be the most patient people on earth. So to be super duper clear, there have been many properly constructed studies since then, all showing that MSG is perfectly safe. Which makes sense because the chemistry doesn't fit this either. So MSG is actually quite simple. It stands for monosodium glutamate. So one sodium glutamate. It is made from two very ordinary things. Sodium, which is the same element that's in table salt, and glutamate, which is an amino acid. They're put together simply to make it a more stable compound that can be used in cooking. Glutamate isn't rare, it's not exotic. It's found naturally in a bunch of things like tomatoes and mushrooms and parmesan and marmite and breast milk. When glutamate is in its free form, as it is in those foods, it activates receptors on your tongue that tell your brain you're eating something with like a savory depth of flavor. And actually, because it's in breast milk, one of the first flavors that babies get used to is that depth of savory taste. And inside the body, MSG doesn't behave any differently from glutamate that comes from any other food. Your body doesn't care whether the glutamate came from the parmesan or seaweed or a shaker of MSG. Glutamate is glutamate. It all ends up in the same place once it's digested. And just a quick recap, if you're wondering what an amino acid is, they are the building blocks of protein, if you like. Proteins are just long chains of amino acids folded into different shapes that do most of the work in your body. They build muscle, they transport oxygen, they fight infection, they run chemical reactions, they are the workhorse of your body. They are what makes you you. There are only about 20 amino acids that your body uses to make all these proteins, which I think is kind of amazing, but that's the magic of maths for you, I suppose. And some of those aminos are called essential because you can't make them. You have to consume them in your diet. Others, like glutamate, your body can make, and they are then called non-essential, which makes absolutely no sense to me because it is still essential. It's just that we can make it ourselves. They call ones that we can make non-essential, despite the fact that, of course, that it is an essential amino acid for us, but it's just we don't need to eat it. Confused? Good. Yeah, I think they could have categorized that slightly better. So it's just an amino acid paired with a sodium. Two incredibly ordinary compounds that you encounter all day, every day, and that you use to fuel biochemical reactions in your body. So the chemistry lines up with the safety record, right? It's boring, it's ordinary, it's super safe, it's something your body knows and needs. Although, yes, of course, anything is toxic in a high enough dose, but it is interesting to note that you'd have to eat 5 times more MSG than table salt to reach toxicity. So MSG is safer than table salt. And it's worth noting that the normal level of consumption isn't actually tiny. The average intake in countries where MSG is widely used, like Japan and Korea, is several grams a day, no issues. And in fact, as they're sort of famous for, people who live in Japan and Korea tend to live longer and healthier lives, which doesn't really add up with the whole idea that MSG is a toxic poison killer death, you know? And gram for gram, MSG contains less sodium than table salt, so it's actually one of those things that some doctors recommend for people who have to watch their sodium intake. One of my nan's favourite snacks was salt sandwiches. Her idea of nutrition was probably different to yours, but she'd get a piece of bread, slather on some butter, sprinkle it with salt, another piece of bread, and she'd enjoy that immensely. I can't say it's overly appealing, but she did at one point have to watch her salt. And I imagine if she had lived long enough, perhaps her doctor would have recommended MSG sandwiches instead. But even if the doctor had, she was part of the generation that was told MSG was the devil. So, it's hard to change that kind of baked-in perception. Even now, you still have restaurants around the world saying, we proudly cook with no MSG. I was looking at some of the spices in my cupboard this morning, and 2 of them have no MSG stamped on them very proudly, and that kind of puts me off that brand. The fact that stigma has stuck around for so long kind of speaks to ignorance and prejudice, right? Fear of chemicals, fear of foreign food, fear of other people, anyone who doesn't look like you. Psychology around discrimination and racism and xenophobia is obviously more complicated, and it's definitely its own episode with a proper expert, but it's pretty evident that othering and pointing the finger is a very effective way of firing people up and changing the narrative. Today, there is a counter movement, which is quite cool. Asian American chefs and writers are reclaiming MSG as part of their culinary identity. They're pointing out the hypocrisy that parmesan and soy sauce are praised for their flavor, and yet Chinese food is demonized for the same ingredient. TikTok cooks are sprinkling MSG on things. They're calling it umami dust, which is a way better name that they should 100% have gone with originally, and maybe we wouldn't be talking about it right now. But younger audiences are seeing it in this format. They're seeing it spoken about in a positive way, so they will not be as easily misled as the billions of us were. Now, this story of MSG is becoming more well-known, probably because of how bizarre parts of it are, but it's a neat little example of how ignorance leads to huge shifts in everything from business and culture to law and regulations. That's why taking a stand against misinformation does not make you unreasonable. It makes you awesome. If you wanted to worry about food, there are much better options to choose from. The lack of fiber in the average person's diet and how there is a strong link to bowel cancer and some other pretty horrible issues. Just how bad sugary drinks like Coke are actually for you. Like, they are much worse than you think. It's not just the sugar, it's also how you consume it. Or if you want a really juicy one, how superfoods are making staple foods unaffordable for the communities that depend on them around the world. All in the name of Instagram. That was last week's episode if you missed it. So because why are we all scared of MSG? Because of bad actors, bad faith, and really bad science. Next week I'm talking all about germ warfare, because you know how much I love microbiology, but it's perhaps a bit different to what you're expecting, because I'll be talking about all the people who don't believe they exist, because this is a whole thing. So I will see you next week. Kia ora, kaitiaki.